Formal.
Good morning, everyone. This doesn't seem to be a shy group. You've all seemed to got to know each other well. I'm David Biet. I'm director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and I'd like to welcome you to the 11th Cross-Border Forum on Energy Issues. This title is Accelerating the Transformation of North American Energy Systems. How much should Canada and the United States restrict international offsets? First off, I'd like to say that the first part of this program is being webcast. The presentations, and then afterwards the webcast will be shut off and everything will be completely quiet off the record. So the webcast will be archived later if you want to refer to it, but the rest of it won't, so feel free to say what's on your mind. I'm very pleased this morning to have Royal Dutch Shell as our major sponsor for the forum, but I'd also like to recognize the Canadian Embassy, who is sponsoring the lunch today, and Hart Energy Publishing, who came in as a partner on the program as well. The Wilson Center, for those of you who don't know, was founded in 1968 by an act of Congress as a memorial to the 28th president, the only president with a PhD. So he got a research institution as opposed to a block of marble out on the mall. Wilson, when he was president, having been president of Princeton and governor of New Jersey, realized that academics and policymakers didn't often speak with each other. And it's in that theme that we have the Wilson Center. We try to bring together policymakers, academics, business people so that we can have a fruitful discussion on the major issues of the day. The center has 22 programs, of which the Canada Institute is one, and about 50 scholars and residents at any time. So if you're thinking about maybe a sabbatical or a corporate sabbatical or a couple months off, talk to me and we can have you come here, and it's a good deal. You think big thoughts, get some nice office space, and you get to hang out with some really interesting people. The Canada Institute works to increase awareness and knowledge about Canada and Canada-U.S. issues among policymakers and opinion leaders, primarily in Washington. We do programs in Canada from time to time. We were founded in 2001, and basically we focus on energy, environment, trade, and border security issues. Upcoming programs next week on November 3rd, General Leslie will be here to speak on the Changing the Tide, a Canadian perspective on Afghanistan. On November 17th, we have a program on Buy American, creating or costing U.S. jobs. And in December, on December 16th, Changing Climates in North American Politics. It's been a very busy fall for us, but this is one of our keystone programs. We're really happy that it's our 11th and the 8th program that we worked with officially with Global, although Lorraine's been with us since the beginning. I would like to recognize some advisory board members. Jim Slutz is here, and David Manning, and Paul Fraser was going to be here. Maybe he'll be here later. Just some housekeeping. Washrooms are down the hall this way. If you need to store a bag, let me know. And at least for the webcast, I'd like you to please turn off your Blackberries because it interferes with the sound. And I'll release that at the break when we're not being broadcast because it makes electronic interference sound. So if you could hold on for the first hour, I'd appreciate it. Anyway, over to you, Lorraine.
Thanks, David. So I'm Lorraine Royer. I'm with Global Public Affairs out of our Calgary office. Tim Kennedy, my colleague in our Ottawa office is here. Lots of you know Tim. He's the director of our climate change and our natural resources and environment practice group in Ottawa. We are a government relations and issues management firm offering a broad range of strategic services to our clients, help them identify relevant public issues, public affairs issues, create tailored advocacy plans, federal, provincial, municipal governments. We have offices in Halifax, Ottawa, Toronto, and Calgary. We've been involved with the Wilson Center and David Biet from the beginning, and from the beginning it was apparent to us that there was an opportunity here to provide opportunities for interaction that went beyond the usual conferences set up on these issues. You can often have a legal conference on the issue and dig in on the legal issues, and you have conferences on the science and conferences on regulatory, et cetera, finance, but often in silos. And the cross-pollination that we hope to achieve here in keeping the room small and decision-maker level and that sort of thing is something we thought would be great for us to get involved with, not only from our policy development point of view, but from our clients' point of view. And so it's been great to work with you. We kind of skipped ahead here. This morning is not designed to solve the issues or reach conclusions by noon, which is kind of a good thing. But we hope to move the dialogue along, to create a light bulb or two, to bring to light challenges that have to be addressed that perhaps we didn't think about when thinking about our own specific areas before. Plant the seed for further productive relationships for people who oftentimes have heard about one another but not met until today. This is important work, and we really appreciate you lending us your time and your brains, and we look forward to the morning's discussion. I want to also thank again the sponsors, you know, as they always say, but it's so true. It isn't possible without them. So thanks very much, Shell, Hart, and the Embassy. And Alexia Kelly, World Resources Institute is going to be your moderator today, so you're going to hear a lot from Alexia. And she's going to keep you guys all on task. We expect, after the panel presentations, a full room discussion on the issue. And Alexia, that's your job.
Great. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much to both the Woodrow Wilson Institute and Global Public Affairs for bringing us all here together and for inviting me to moderate. It's a real honor to be here this morning. I'd like to take just a moment before we kick off the presentations to go around the room and introduce ourselves. So if you could just indicate your name, with whom you work, where you're from, and just 1 second on sort of what your portfolio looks like, that would be great. We could just start here.
Satya Das, Cambridge Strategies, Edmonton, Strategic Advice, Public Policy.
Duncan Wood, the Center for Strategic and Central Studies here in Washington, and ECAM, the University of Mexico City.
Brenda Kenny, I'm president of the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association in Calgary, Alberta, and also a part-time fellow at the Institute of Sustainable Energy, Environment, and Economy at the University of Calgary.
Daniel Hall, I'm with the Office of Environment and Energy at the U.S. Treasury Department.
Joel Bluestein, ICF International, Environmental and Energy Consulting.
I'm Reid Harvey, I manage the Climate Economics Group at U.S. EPA.
I'm Wendy Crucia, International Climate Change Advisor from the law firm, Southern based in Washington.
I'm Tony Strackley, and I manage the government affairs for Alliance Pipeline, a natural gas pipeline from Canada to the Chicago market.
I'm Bill Irwin. I'm with Chevron, where I manage their international government affairs out in our Washington, D.C. office.
Molly Suchman with the law firm of Troutman Sanders, and I'm Washington counsel to the Canadian Electricity Association.
Pierre Guillemont, Canadian Electricity Association, representing utilities, generators, transmitters, and distribution utilities.
Gary Marr with the Alberta Washington office, representing the Alberta government here in D.C.
David Manning, I'm just here to make Gary look good. Originally from Alberta, I'm now with Energy Bradley, which is the U.S. arm of Climate Change Capital, which is a large UK-based free energy company.
Bruce Carson, Canada School of Energy and Environment. Spend most of our time advising Minister Pennis on climate change policy in Canada.
Jim Sleuth, Global Energy Strategies, energy project development, new technology commercialization, and do advising on climate issues, particularly carbon capture and storage.
Tim Kennedy with Global Public Affairs.
Atlee Clark, former consultant with Global Public Affairs and current graduate student here in Washington at the Elliott School at George Washington.
Michael Evans, I'm here with the Quebec Government Office in Washington.
Mary Ann Reed, I represent the Manitoba government here in Washington.
Shanna Brown, Western Governors Association, and I'm here in the Washington, D.C. office.
Doug Worswolf, Tech Resources Limited. I run the south side.
Good morning, Fred Potter, Hard Energy Consulting, Washington, D.C. Focus on crude oil processing and motor fuel composition worldwide here in Washington, D.C.
Excuse me, Matt Brady, our National Services Director. Lorraine Royer,
Victor Flatt, Staff Professor of Environmental Law and Director of the Center for Law, Environment, Adaptation, and Resources at the University of North Carolina. I'm affiliated scholar of carbon trading at the Global Energy Management Institute at the University of Houston.
Ken Berlin, I head the environmental and climate change practices at the law firm of Skadden Arps.
David Chappell, I'm with Williams Energy. I look after the Williams business in Canada.
Tom Sullivan, I work with Ambassador David Wilkins at Nelson Mullins, representing the province of Saskatchewan.
Rick Heinzman, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. I work on climate change policy and Calgary.
Bob Greco, I manage downstream operations for the American Petroleum Institute Trade Association for U.S. oil and natural gas industry.
think we'll skip introducing the panelists just since you guys will hear plenty from us. And you'll get to hear introductions individually. Folks at the back of the room who we missed, Ben and...
I'm Ben Hank with the majority staff of the House Energy Committee.
I'm Ken Kress with candidates too. David?
Hi, Alex Custer, candidates.
Great. And there's also plenty of chairs at the table. You just have to kind of sneak up to the front of the room, so please don't be shy. Wonderful. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to kick things off with a brief overview presentation, sort of talking about offsets, the role that they play in cap and trade, a very brief look at the U.S. legislation currently under consideration, and then some framing questions to get us started, and then we'll just move right down the line. We are going to be on a very tight schedule. All of the panelists have been admonished to stay strictly to 10 minutes, so I will endeavor to start us off and set a good example. I think we'll probably take one clarifying question after each presentation just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, and then we'll go ahead and move into the full discussion directly thereafter. So without further ado, hopefully my PowerPoint is right here. Give us just 1 second. Great. All right. So we have a lot of ground to cover. Obviously, offsets are an important and integral part of the U.S. legislation under consideration and of most of the regional and international programs that are in various stages of development today. First, just start with the very basics. What is an offset? An offset is defined as a reduction or avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions or an increase in sequestration due to an activity implemented specifically to compensate for emissions occurring elsewhere. And this idea of being implemented specifically for emissions occurring elsewhere actually becomes quite important, foundational to what an offset is and how we assess its quality. Offsets are a policy-driven commodity that are generated from GHG reduction projects that meet a specific set of requirements. So this is not something that has any kind of inherent value in and of itself. Its value is imbued through the policy that creates it and enables it. And I think that it makes it somewhat of a unique animal. It's not like a pork belly that I can hand you. It actually is a strict set of quality criteria and other policy criteria that create it and imbue it with its value. I'm not going to go through the whole list of offset quality criteria, what they are and what they mean. You've all seen them before. Offsets need to be additional. That is, they need to represent incremental emission reductions to what otherwise would have occurred. They need to be clearly owned. They need to be based on a realistic baseline. That is, the projection of emissions that would have occurred in the absence of the offset project. They need to be accurately quantified. Offsets need to address leakage, which is typically defined as an increase or decrease in emissions that occur outside of a project's boundaries as a result of your project. They need to be permanent. So from the perspective of the atmosphere, they need to ensure an equivalent reduction in GHGs over 100 years or a certain amount of time that's relevant to mitigating climate change. They also need to be monitored. They need to be verified, and they need to be registered and retired when claims have been made against them. And so today we're going to be talking about the larger and broader policy frameworks that we need to ensure that these key quality criteria are able to be met and that allow offsets to play their role in cap and trade. So what exactly do offsets do? How do they work relative to cap and trade? In a system without offsets, we have all of our reductions coming from cap sectors. So in this sector, in our cap sector, it emits 75 tons. We implement energy efficiency projects. We do other activities that reduce emissions, and we've achieved our emission reduction objective of 10 tons. For simplicity's sake, we'll say that this system is going to derive all of its emission reductions from offsets. So we implement offset projects in uncapped sectors that reduce emissions from 100 tons to 90 tons. These 10 tons are then offset and applied to the cap sector's emission reductions. It's important to note, though, that emissions have not actually decreased in the cap sectors. The cap sectors are still emitting 75. But because we've achieved global atmospheric reductions of emissions from 175 to 165, we've achieved our emission reduction objective. If those tons are not additional, all we've done is trade hot air. So in essence, we haven't actually done anything to address the problem of climate change, but we've created a lot of money, a lot of infrastructure, and a lot of time into generating and trading a commodity that doesn't actually do anything for the environment. So this is, again, why these key quality criteria are so important and need to be such a foundational part of the conversation when we're talking about offsets. There are both advantages and disadvantages of including offsets in cap and trade. Advantages are fairly obvious. They provide cost containment. They can drive emission reductions in uncapped sectors that otherwise might not have occurred. They can drive new technology in uncapped sectors. They can provide technology and knowledge transfer to developing countries, and they can provide substantial environmental and economic co-benefits. There are also disadvantages. Disadvantages include the fact that offsets can significantly compromise the emission reduction goals of your program. If those offsets do not represent real additional reductions, then we haven't actually done anything to mitigate climate change. It can be difficult and costly to administer. Offsets are complicated. They can be very subjective, and they require a large infrastructure to manage and administer them. If they're not limited, they can result in few cap sector reductions and slow technology transformation or the dissemination of low-carbon technologies. And I think that this is a key thing that we're going to be discussing here today as we think about the role that offsets play in energy policy. Offsets can favor certain sectors over others. So, for example, in the U.S. legislation, farmers and forests, even though they contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, are being rewarded for reducing their emissions, whereas the electricity sector is actually being required to reduce their emissions at their own expense. And so thinking about the equity issues involved of rewarding some sectors for reducing emissions as opposed to penalizing others and requiring them to reduce, I think is an important component of the political conversation that needs to be taken into account. And then finally, offsets can provide a disincentive for uncapped sectors to eventually accept emissions caps. And you've seen this as a key component of the conversation around the role that international offsets play in bringing developing countries into the cap and trade fold, if you will, getting them to come along and accept binding emission reduction targets. So with that broader overview, I wanted to spend just a minute talking about the status of U.S. legislation. I'm sure many of you are intimately familiar with the details of the passage of this legislation through Congress, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I wanted to look at some of the key offset provisions, particularly as they relate to international offsets. As you all know, the House passed the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009 on June 26, 2009, thanks in no small part to some of the people in this room today. It's a comprehensive climate change and energy bill that was obviously landmark legislation in the United States. The Kerry-Boxer bill was introduced by the Environment and Public Works Committee several weeks ago. The chairman's mark was released last Friday, so the statistics you see in the next couple of slides are representative of the chairman's mark. EPW is currently holding hearings, I think today and yesterday, and has stated a goal of marking up the bill before Thanksgiving. There are, however, a number of other committees of jurisdiction that may or may not be taking part in marking up the legislation or introducing various pieces. So all of those details are still being worked out right now. Offsets play a large role in both H.R. 2454, the House bill, and the Senate bill 1733. They both set a system-level limit of 2 billion tons. But how that system-level limit is enforced varies in each of the bill. So in H.R. 2454, it varies by year, but it's based on an equation that's embedded in the legislation that essentially allows you to calculate the firm level limit of offsets, or the total amount of an entity's compliance obligation that can be met through the retirement of offsets. That number amounts to about 30% in 2013 and about 65% of an entity's total compliance obligation in 2050. The Senate bill has dealt with this slightly differently. They've established a ratio of your total compliance obligation, and so there's actually not a way that we've been able to figure out calculating what that limit's going to look like. But it's designed to ensure that there's no more than 2 billion tons in the system at any given year. Both bills allow domestic and international offsets, but the proportions with which they're allowed to be used are different. H.R. 2454 allows a 50-50 split with some adjustment clauses that I'm not going to go into in great detail. They're written up there. And then The Senate bill actually significantly restricts the use of international offsets. So they're expecting that 75% of the offset supply will be coming from domestically sourced offsets, and 25% will be coming from international. Domestic sources in the U.S. that are expected to be uncovered include agriculture, forestry, and potentially some coal mine methane and smaller sources of methane emissions. Both bills apply a 1.25 discount to international offsets after 2016. So if a compliance entity wishes to use international offsets to meet its compliance obligation, for every it's a 4 to 5 ratio. So for every 4 allowances they're wishing to cover, they'll need to retire 5 offset credits. There are also a number of offset categories that are eligible in both of the bills. HR 2454 allows U.S. domestic offsets, and it's important to note that this is actually a diversion from existing international offset programs. So the existing international offset programs do not allow domestically sourced offsets to be used to meet international emission reduction goals, and also require that any offsets generated go through the multilateral international institution, the Clean Development Mechanism, and the executive board, or a separate board, an administrative process for the Joint Implementation Program. So the U.S. is really striking new ground here with some of these provisions. EPA will be responsible for promulgating and regulating the international offset program. In HR 2454, USDA actually has jurisdiction over the domestic agriculture and forestry tons. Both bills allow the use of CDM credits, so the UNFCCC approved credits, offset credits. They allow bilateral sectoral agreements to be established for emission reduction credits, and they also allow international reduced deforestation. The Kerry-Boxer bill limits the use of U.S.-issued international offsets, and so it does not actually grant EPA authority to promulgate regulations for the crediting of international offsets, except under certain circumstances. I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but this gives you an idea of the role, the very large role that offsets play in the bill and in both bills, and the timelines in which those offsets phase in. So what are we trying to accomplish today? I think one of the questions that we'll be asking is, what's the right number of offsets in the system? How many offsets should there be? And how does that number relate to technology transformation and the dissemination of low-carbon technologies in our CAP sectors? Clearly, in order to meet the emission reduction targets that we wish to meet over time, we're going to need to implement substantial changes in our electricity and power infrastructure as well as transportation infrastructure. So thinking about what role the government should play in that, do we force it? Do we let the market take care of it over time? How are we going to address some of these thorny issues? What can we learn from existing offset programs in both the U.S. and in Canada? So there are a number of programs that are underway currently, both at the state and regional level in the U.S. in various stages of implementation, and in Canada. And is there a future role for international harmonization of offset infrastructure? So there's a number of programs that have already been started, have developed offset infrastructure. Is there a way that we can build off of that and leverage that? And I'm going to end it there. I did not do a good job of sticking to my 10-minute timeline, so I will claim moderator's prerogative and apologize. But with that, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Dallas Bertraw. Dallas is a senior fellow.
Yes.
Sorry, senior fellow with Resources for the Future, and it's a real honor to introduce him here today.
Thank you. Do I have this on? Okay. Okay, thank you. It's sort of humbling to be here because I think about everything I'm going to say. There's someone in this room that knows more about it than I do. But my charge is to try to put out some ideas that may be thought-provoking or provocative to try to stimulate the debate, and I'm happy to share those. So the question that I think we want to put our teeth into is, consider the consideration of offsets versus investment in the domestic energy economy. And if investments made sense, we should do them anyway, but we might not do them anyway. So the sentiment is to limit offsets in order to force greater emission reductions at home, not just for the pain, but for the gain of accelerating the transformation of the energy system. So should we limit the role of offsets to help achieve greater investment at home? And let's think about this at two levels. First, within North America, the question of Canada-United States linkage. is essentially one way to imagine offsets that are going to affect the U.S. domestic legislation and also affect Canada. As my colleague Carolyn Fisher pointed out at the C.D. Howe Institute forum a couple weeks ago in Calgary, 80% of Canada's exports come to the United States and 70% of imports come from the United States. So the economies are intimately linked already, and it would appear that linkage is an obvious benefit for both parties. For Canada, linkage represents cost management because to achieve at least the same level of proportional reductions is higher cost in Canada than in the United States. For the U.S., linkage may raise allowance prices by $1 is about it, but it has an important political payoff, and it offers cost effectiveness, harmonization of the policies, and may limit price volatility because a broader market always does so. But linking is like a social disease, that one program is going to inherit the characteristics of the other program with respect to cost management, whether there's a price ceiling and a floor, whether there's a renewable portfolio standard and other kinds of energy standards that are going to affect the price and other direct policies, and with respect to offsets. So what the U.S. does with offsets will contaminate the Canadian market and vice versa if the markets are formally linked. So now let's think about this second international offset, which has to do with the decisions of the United States and more largely North America, perhaps even including Mexico, with the international role for international offsets. And the issue that dominates the debate when I hear it talked about most of the time is the merit of the offsets. But merit has at least two dimensions. One is environmental integrity. If the point is reduce emissions, then offsets have to represent real emission reductions, as Alexia pointed out really well. So I want you to hold in your mind a comparison to utility-sponsored energy efficiency programs. Advocates say they are low cost. Both are evaluated against counterfactual baselines. Both compare what might have happened with what might have happened in the alternative. So they're problematic. And one can imagine a critique of offset programs that advocate for investment in energy transition that includes energy efficiency programs that are utility sponsored, but they both share the same sort of conceptual problems. Project-based offsets, like project-based efficiency programs, are problematic because of the selection bias. The bad chases out the good. That is, projects that would have happened anyway, one of the terms that Alexia pointed to, can outcompete other projects with greater actual emission reductions. Sectoral offsets is a new idea that's embodied in much of the dialogue around the U.S. legislation. It's a new regime, and I think that it hasn't been thought through exactly how it's going to be applied, but the way I like to think that it might work out is that technology measures would be given sweeping ex-ante authority, but discounted across the board so that project by project, wind-based project or coal bed methane-based project would not be evaluated individually so much as ex-ante rules saying that 70% discount on any new wind project, go forth and build. And there won't be ex-post project reviews. Things like this you can imagine dramatically broadening the pipeline for projects because the CDM mechanism, frankly, isn't anywhere capable to handle the kind of offsets that are envisioned in the U.S. Policy proposals. And similarly, land use projects may be measured in the aggregate. From nations have the authority under international treaty to block satellite imaging of their country, but if they sign on and allow that kind of imaging to occur, then their land use projects may be measured in the aggregate and rental values paid nation level governments, and leaving it to those nations to decide how they're going to manage land use decisions to maintain carbon intensity of their forests, etc. So sector offsets, I feel, could emerge to offer greater accountability. But who is accountable? Who is paid? This brings us to the second aspect of how to evaluate the role for offsets going forward. And that is that offsets represent a transition path, another point which Alexia foreshadowed. The transition path is, at least in my mind, at least as important as the actual emission reductions that are achieved. So I think a little bit of the concern has been misplaced in thinking about whether these ton reductions are real, and we should focus more on recognizing that offsets provide a path forward for developing nations to achieve new technology, develop an entrepreneurial class, develop institutions and governance mechanisms, and take steps ultimately towards accepting timetables and targets of their own in decades from now. My trouble really is with the expansive use of offsets, except to recognize that they must not be a permanent regime. In other words, even if we allow for expansive use of offsets under the U.S. legislation in the near decade, the architects should see that public and market financing in the next decade is paving the way for developing country own country financing, ultimately at a much higher level, in order to achieve to reduce the increase in emissions that are going to occur in those countries in decades hence. So let's just consider the magnitude of the climate problem for a minute. Thank you. Deforestation represents 17% of the emissions globally today, and that's growing. So what's really changed in the last 10 years is now we have, during the Kyoto period, we had the developing world rejecting commitments or rejecting a formal role in taking responsibility for emission reductions. And today, many developing nations are asking to make commitments and to be able to participate in markets. In a way, this transition path, we've already taken steps along this transition path, exactly as one would hope that the role of offsets in the international political economy would help us achieve. Domestically, our obligations just outstrip the politically affordable mitigation options that are available. So offsets play a crucial role in the Waxman-Markey-Carey-Boxer legislation. And, you know, we haven't talked about the fact, people don't talk much about the fact that there's this role for direct financing of forest projects outside the cap. I call this the public option. In the forest sector, forest set-aside will achieve up to a 10% of the cap, but it will not be counted towards the cap. It's mandated to achieve 720 million tons per year. And couple that with the offset discount of 5 to 4, which Alexia measured, these investments in sector-based offsets and international forests take our cap levels under U.S. legislation from 17 to 20%, depending on the legislation, to a range of 28 to 33% in 2020. That is 28 to 33% reductions below 2005 levels, depending on that range, depending on the offset availability. So really, there's something going on under the radar that takes us much further than the debate that's taking place just with respect to the precise definition of the cap that we're all talking about. So this is encouraging. The problem, though, remains for me, and I think the problem focus of this discussion is the expansive use of emission reductions under the cap that would be accomplished with offsets to help achieve emission reductions under the cap. So, you know, I'm personally very happy about, surprised, but happy about the 5% of allowance value that's going to the investment in international forests. The question is, how much are we going to allow for substitution of emission reductions on the domestic front with international offsets for those emissions that are counted under the cap, and does that crowd out other investments that might occur in our energy infrastructure? Well, funds are needed for energy transformation at home, to be sure, but even more importantly, from the climate perspective, funds are needed for the energy transformation abroad. And that's the trade-off I see. If you want to view this from a climate perspective, then the call for funds abroad is very paramount. We have to avoid emission growth in the developing world. So in sum, I think reliance on sector offsets is necessary and desirable. I would join the call for a domestic transformation of the energy sector, but it isn't just investment of dollars in networks, transmission networks and technology that we need. We also have institutional failures at home, which let, for example, $50 billion in annual transmission benefits go unrealized from expansion of the transmission grid. And it's not just a question of throwing money at that problem. We let low-cost, no-cost investments go unrealized. I think, to tell us go back, and in summary, project-based offsets and project-based utility-sponsored energy efficiency programs have limited usefulness. They have a role, but they have a limited role. The transition in both cases should be to provide broad-based incentives and measurement and let go of the actual sequence of events that will unfold. Sectoral programs are the transition path for offsets, and for the domestic energy transformation, I see tariff reform, including time-of-use pricing, decoupling, along with two-part tariffs, incentives for shareholders to make investments in energy efficiency and actually earn profits on investments in energy efficiency, and annual rates of progress with incentives measured through system-level efficiency by organizations analogous to measurement for sectoral-based offsets. And this could be achieved at the organizational, provincial, or state governmental level, and with rewards, financial rewards, flowing to those organizations or state or provincial governments in a similar model as sectoral offsets abroad. The transition we need in each case first is an institutional one. Thank you.
Do we have any quick clarifying questions for Dallas? That was a lot of information in a short amount of time. Great. This is the problem. You tell people they have 10 minutes, so everybody just talks faster. Thank you very much, Dallas. That was very informative. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Gary Ertel,
yeah.
sorry. Gary assumed the role of Regulatory Affairs Manager for Shell Canada Limited in September of 2007. And I'll let him say a little bit more about who he is and what he does for Shell, and also provide us with his thoughts on the role of international offsets.
Excellent, thank you. Alexia, could I bring up my presentation? Thank you very much. I don't think there's much more I need to say. I'm the Regulatory Affairs Manager for Shell Canada Oil Sands, and if you want to know more, let's get together. With your indulgence, I'm going to stick to my prepared script to stay within the 10 minutes. If I try to do this freestyle, Alexia is going to end up turning off my microphone, and I don't want that to happen. And if in case what you hear doesn't make sense, I've got some slides here that have some of the key messages on it. Shell supports the adoption of a cap-and-trade program in Canada within a regulatory framework that targets absolute GHG reductions. A cap-and-trade program would enable the most cost-effective GHG reduction measures that could include some combination of GHG reductions at our facilities along with allowance and offset credits that we can acquire through purchase or trade. It follows that Shell supports the broadest possible access and use of both domestic and international offsets. To support Shell's position, I'd like to briefly talk about the following issues. The nature of international offsets and the necessity for Canada to allow broad access and use of these offsets, the benefits of international offsets, and the challenges with international offsets. So there'll be a little bit of a duplication with Alexia. First, let me review some of Shell's premises that shape our thinking with respect to international offsets. All GHG emissions that are submitted for compliance purposes must be real, verified GHG reductions. Second, climate change is a global issue requiring a global response. Third, the global GHG plan must be married with the global energy strategy that recognizes worldwide energy demand will double by 2050. And lastly, we can only be successful in achieving our long-term GHG targets if we accelerate the development and deployment of advanced technologies like CCS on a global basis. Most of you are familiar with the UNFCCC, CDM, and JI projects programs. These projects and programs are still in their very early stage of development, and certainly improvements and refinements will be needed to upgrade the infrastructure and create a liquid and robust offset market. By May 2009, 1,600 CDM projects have been registered with a total annual GHG offset of about 300 million tons. Another 2,900 projects are currently in various stages of approval. The EU emission trading system already utilizes these offsets, and it's anticipated that the increased market demand from regulated countries like Canada and the U.S. will stimulate the market growth that will bring many more projects to the table. The need for the added compliance opportunities through utilization of international offsets is underscored by the ambitious GHG reduction targets being adopted by jurisdictions. Canada's proposed 20% reduction by 2020 from 2006 levels has been criticized by some as being too weak, since it equates to only 3% reduction from 1990 levels. GHG targets for developed countries, including the EU, are running at a rate of an energy efficiency improvement rate of about 2.5% per year and a rate of fuel decarbonization of just over 1% per year. When these numbers are applied to Canada, they closely approximate the target proposed by the federal government. The situation faced by Canada is that the growth of our energy-intensive resource sector is very large, and especially large relative to the size of the Canadian economy, so the rate of GHG reduction appears to be much smaller. The 20% federal target will be challenging, as Shell has estimated that only a very aggressive program for domestic GHG reduction in Canada will be able to achieve at most a 10 to 12% GHG reduction by 2020, leaving a compliance gap of 8 to 10%. This means that the Canadian obligated parties will either have to buy allowances from linked emission trading systems or purchase domestic or international offsets from non-regulated parties. The broad coverage of regulated GHG emitting sectors in Canada will limit the availability of domestic offsets. There are ample Canadian studies that demonstrate that domestic offset supply will be far less than the demand by a factor of 5 times or more. Similarly, in the U.S., the supply of domestic offsets is expected to fall considerably short of the allowable 1 billion tons per year limit. The U.S. and EU designers of cap-and-trade recognize this domestic offset supply shortfall and built in ample access to international offsets. Canada faces the same issues and needs to plan for greater access and use of international offsets. In addition to addressing the compliance shortfall, there are 5 added benefits of international offsets I'd like to touch on. First of all, they provide compliance flexibility. The expanded use of offsets for compliance would play a major role in compliance cost containment. Many of the estimates of U.S. compliance cost credit access to international offsets as a significant factor in keeping these costs down. The EPA analysis of Waxman and Markey forecasts that international offsets would be fully utilized to the maximum 1 billion tons per year. The allowance price in 2020 is estimated to be $17 to $33 per ton of CO2, and that without international offsets, this price would be approximately double. International offsets also enable compliance in the early years while advanced technologies continue in their progress to commercialization. Third, they provide countries like Canada the chance to showcase advanced GHG reduction technologies on a worldwide stage, opening up new markets. Fourth, the International Offset Program engages developing countries in GHG reduction management, establishes an early CO2 price signal, and provides the needed financing. And finally, the flow of project credits would help build a global CO2 market. Let me touch on 4 key challenges associated with international offsets and the potential response. First of all, assuring environmental integrity with a simple and efficient market mechanism is one of the greatest challenges of international offsets. There are suggestions that a tiered approval system, grouping of similar projects, types, and the use of standardized methods could help address this issue. Other possibilities that should be investigated include development of additional offset protocols and streamlining of verification, or satellite agreements for specific sectors, such as CCS for the electricity sector in developing countries. Second, there will be challenges of getting enough real GHG offsets into the market in the early stages, so the need for obligated parties can be met. To support more rapid availability of offsets, there should be consideration given to broadening forestry offsets, and in particular, afforestation or reforestation initiatives. We recognize that there are issues related to implementation and permanence of these credits, but this source of GHG reduction is too important to lie dormant. Third, there are political challenges associated with wealth transfer. Countries want to see their own emissions reduced and to have investment dollars stay within their borders. The reality is that the GHG targets exceed the capacity of domestic GHG reduction, and this necessitates the need to access real GHG reduction through external projects. Certainly, countries can minimize the wealth transfer concerns by careful selection of their GHG targets, reasonable burden sharing, and by providing economic incentives to encourage domestic reductions in both the domestic regulated sectors and the domestic offset sector. Alberta's and the federal government's initiatives and investments in CCS and the promotion of cogen, Ontario's investment in transit and nuclear power, and Quebec's support of both hydro and wind power are prime examples of making domestic GHG reduction more cost competitive and keeping investment dollars in Canada. Fourth, finally, there are concerns raised about the international offset's focus on those projects with the lowest cost and highest yield, as opposed to investments in projects that involve more sophisticated technologies that can more broadly reduce GHG emissions in developing countries. Shell believes this more advanced approach can be encouraged if technologies like CCS are recognized by the UNFCCC CDM or within a new post-2012 mechanism. We need international CCS certification that delivers a tradable certificate for 1 ton of CO2 stored underground and supports the CDM mechanism. To summarize, the benefits of international offsets are compelling. First, as a cost containment tool to fill the compliance gap as a result of aggressive GHG targets. Second, as a means to engage developing countries in GHG management. And third, to act as a transition mechanism for more advanced technologies. The U.S. and the EU have embraced international offsets as a vital compliance mechanism. Shell encourages the Canadian government to do the same. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Gary? Yes, sir.
Gary, do you have a carbon price in mind that would make the offsets internationally viable? Like, what would be a range that would be economical?
I don't think we really have a price in mind. I think we're talking about market forces determining what that price is. I really wouldn't even want to speculate.
Great. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Andy Ridge. Andy is the Director of Climate Change of the Climate Change Secretariat in the Alberta Department of Environment, and he leads a team dedicated to developing integrated policy approaches for achieving provincial climate change objectives. Yeah. Andy, do you have a PowerPoint?
I do. So as that's bringing up, so hopefully my clock hasn't started yet. We'll get that going. I too am going to read.
It's totally started.
It hasn't started. Good. Good. I have a bit of a warm up. I too am going to read from some sheets. I might actually read from Jerry's because I think mine might take a little longer. But and also I came across a very mean customs agent when I was coming in, and he's asked me what I was doing. I actually said I was speaking to the Woodrow Wilson Cross-Dresser Forum on energy issues. And some of you may know I'm actually speaking at that next week. So I want to make sure that I actually have the right messages. And I am going to take a bit of a different approach. I'm not here to pitch or sell a position. Just talk about a provincial perspective, and hopefully through that there's an understanding or appreciation of the logic of perhaps why we've landed on an approach that's focused more on technology rather than international credit. So we don't want the fight of either or, but more let people decide. So I am pleased to be here today to, oh my goodness, that's the one, let's do that.
There we go.
I do have slides. I don't know actually what's on them, so if you don't like what I'm saying, refer to the slides. There might be a more interesting story there. Assuming I can actually change. There we go. So I do appreciate the opportunity to be here to provide some provincial insights. I may be a bit biased, but I do think that we have an important perspective to raise, certainly from the Alberta and Canadian perspective. First, Alberta has moved forward. We put a price on carbon. We have a regulatory system within our system, or within our province. So we have our industry that's facing a carbon price that their competitors and trade partners today are not facing. Connects to a second point that we're a major exporter to the United States, number one supplier of oil imports into the U.S., and so we have a unique relationship already with this nation. And finally, we too have admired the challenges for a number of years, but we have moved into implementation. As a result, we've been challenged by our own elected officials and the public that they represent to have a very coherent and practical story. So we've gone down to the next level, and so part of what I'm going to talk about this morning is really that story. We always have to keep in mind that while we are only a fraction of global emissions, about a tenth of the U.S., we do still have some unique challenges, as reflected in that blurry slide, at least from my perspective. Again, this is not to justify why we're not supportive of international offsets, but instead why we think technology and the focus of technology from the Alberta perspective is probably more beneficial over the long term, even though in the short term there may be some trade-offs with respect to seeing immediate reductions. Quickly into the Canadian context, there is so much focus on what's going on in the U.S., but there is some stuff going on in Canada across the board. So most provinces and territories are advancing legislation and requirements. In Alberta, we have the first in North America multi-industrial regulatory framework. So we have about 100 facilities, various sectors that are covered under our program that started in July of 2007. We do have a credit trading system. To the surprise of some people, under our program, it's a provincial-based offset system, so we have fundamental experience in the offset market now, as much as we also have a very unique tool that's focused on connecting compliance to technology investment. So I think we acknowledge that to be able to see the changes that we need to see, the energy shifts, the fundamental implementation of step change transformative technology is going to come at a high price of carbon, and no politician on this planet at this point is willing to put in place that price of carbon. So it's a fine dance that we need to see to signal that investment today, but realize that there's other means by which we need to perhaps motivate that behavior and ensure that perhaps the price of carbon moves up at some point in time to see some of that investment stream. we think we have an approach that begins to work in the short term to actually pool investment from industry. So rather than one company trying to find the right low-cost or transformative technology investment, we pool the compliance obligations of multiple industries with the Alberta system into a technology fund. Essentially serves as a technology permit. Companies can pay at a rate of $15 per ton Canadian at this point against their compliance obligations. Right now in Alberta, this mechanism actually accounts for about 60 to 70% of compliance. So it's not the only means by which companies are coming into compliance. There are real reductions as well that are being realized today within the Alberta system. But again, it's about pooling in the short term the limited resources that do exist to focus and concentrate the investment efforts into the transformative technologies we've all talked about and admired. So we heard time and time again at the heart of climate change is an energy issue. Recognize that to address it over the long term, we do need fundamental shifts in our energy systems. We want to balance economic, environmental, and energy interests. So the question is how do we do that? And obviously technology is front and center, but some of the ideas and concepts I want to talk about today more relate to not 3 E's, but 3 T's: transition, targets, and technology. And the premise we're working to in our fear factor is cross-border tariffs and speculation that the approach that we're doing in Canada might be incongruent with what's going on in the United States. So the assumption that maybe we need a mirror on the 49th parallel so we have identical systems. What we're saying is that if you really get at the heart of what we're trying to do, there are a variety of different means to approach our shared outcomes. One key consideration is that we are in a transition period. We've already heard from some of the previous speakers already that we are in a transition, but we've collectively admired that the demand for energy is going to continue to increase in the foreseeable future. Fossil fuels will play a critical role, and as reflected in this slide, we're feeling it directly in Alberta in terms of our emissions forecast. That's largely the growth is being driven by the desires and appetites of the U.S. to drive their cars. So it doesn't mean that we need to focus less on renewable fuels in the short term and other self-sustainable alternatives. It just suggests that our ability to actually see meaningful reductions is as much about our aspirational long-term goals as it is about getting a price of carbon in the system today. So we know that a smart policy will ease in over time. So we don't need to solve for 2050 and figure out, or even 2020, and figure out how the two systems are going to match. We just need to get something going today. And we have significant experience in trading commodities across the border, good, bad, and ugly, but it's experience nonetheless. So if we think about it as a transitional effort in the short term, it will help, I think, to stimulate and allow for a more collaborative dialogue between the North and South and allow perhaps different approaches to emerge in the short term. With respect to targets, climate change is complex. It's what some people refer to as a simmering issue. It's sort of below the surface, and so as a result, the debate has largely been focusing on what is an acceptable or comparable system in Canada versus the U.S. for the rest of the world. And the two elements that have emerged out of that are what are the types of targets? What percentage off 1990 do you have? Is it bigger or smaller than ours? Is it do you have cap and trade? Yes or no? And the challenge is that as a result, the starting point for North American integration has really been around, do you have cap and trade, yes or no? Is your target this or that? I think these aren't necessarily the best starts or means to compare the various systems. Cap and trade in and of itself is merely a policy tool. We know that in the various regimes that are advancing, there are ways to buy your way out. So it's not an absolute real cap within a domestic system. It's complemented by buying your way out. So the critical piece is how do you send that carbon price signal to get the behavioral change? And there are different ways to send that price signal. It's a key message we want to flag. Similarly with overall targets, to say 20% below 1990 in one system is comparable to 20% below 1990 in another system is to some extent naive in the sense that we are facing different cost curves. In particular, within Canada, we have a very steep cost curve. And so if we were to see by 2020 the price that's emerging out of some of the U.S. analysis of a $20 to $30 price per ton, the line right below the business as usual essentially reflects the level of reductions that we'd see in Alberta. The bulk of the compliance obligation to get to something like a 20% target is that we're paying somebody to do something on our behalf. And so the challenge isn't necessarily that we have to pay that amount. It's we would prefer to see it go into a particular type of investment. For Alberta, it would be technology rather than the international market. So we feel $1 into technology pays more dividends to the globe than $1 into the international market, certainly in the short term. And it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be support for international development and support investment in projects, but there may be better means rather than the carbon market to find the right reduction opportunities through bilaterals and other arrangements. The last piece I'll focus on is technology. Again, transforming our energy systems, it's admirable. We know we need to do it. It's going to take some time. We know at this point there's only really a short list globally of actions that we can take. And so for Alberta, carbon capture and storage is front and center for both Alberta and Canada. We've put $2 billion on the table. It's been complemented by our federal government and other provinces in the order of $3 billion. So we are serious with respect to this technology. It's one of the largest investments on the planet. And we're doing this also recognizing at the end of the day, right now, at least about 75% of Canada's electricity emissions come from low or no emitting sources. So our challenge is in some parts of the country, that such as Alberta, coal is still a key factor. And of course, there's the oil sands, which I'd say is a fuel supply that's gained almost mythical status. It's still only 5% of Canada's emissions, a fraction of global emissions. And on a life cycle basis, reflected in this slide, it is comparable to in many instances, to the U.S. crude. With carbon average, with carbon capture and storage, it's only going to improve. But we know that it is a growth area in North America as energy demand continues to grow up. So the key piece, again, is if we get investment in the technology, investment at source in the short term, that's how we begin to shift the behaviors and transform our systems. So we do have 2 projects that have been announced in the province and more coming with respect to carbon capture and storage. We feel that we have an approach at this point that balances the economic, energy, and environmental needs that politicians speak to, that the public expects. We think we have an approach that reflects some of the realities of trying to take some early action on climate change. Given some of the mitigation potential that we do have in the province and in Canada, in particular, a very steep cost curve relative to most of our competitors, given that there is a social license to operate in Alberta that expects reductions at source, certainly over the long term, rather than our companies buying their way out, and the fact that there is competition for capital, we think our system effectively puts a price on carbon that's comparable or can be comparable within the North American context, so we don't have leakage up, down, or north, south, east, west. We think that critical is to our story is ensuring that there is a level playing field. So within the provincial context and the Canadian context, we will seek to ensure there is a comparable playing field, irregardless of the policy approaches we take. But we stress that serious consideration needs to be placed on the realistic pace and nature of this transition of our energy systems that we've all talked about, clarity around the true degree of the effort that's needed on the various targets that we all commit to, and a clear plan for deploying and developing technologies. So I'm going to leave the last bit and hopefully to some prompting questions, but just thank the opportunity for offering some insights from the Alberta government and Canadian perspective, and hopefully we'll draw out some comments on perhaps the strengths and weaknesses of some of the logic that we put forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Go ahead.
I just want to clarify. When you talk about, you sound like you want to base reduction targets on the cost curve to achieve the reduction, which presumably would occur if you had a completely and fully integrated system around the world, because the prices would balance out. But am I correct that you're also saying the position of Alberta is that would not be sufficient because the province wants to co-benefit to domestic reduction? Are there political reasons for domestic reductions, or?
I think it's just the practical reality of our mitigation potential. So at, again, $20 to $30 per ton, if that was the global price, we think that that's a bearable cost for our industry. But what's reflected in the slide is about 80% of our compliance would be paying the international market, would be paying the U.S. Treasury, would be paying someone else. And so we're saying, for our citizens, how does that help us over the long term? We think that if the emissions are going to continue to grow up, offsetting those simply by paying into the carbon market probably is not an acceptable or sustainable solution. So our sense is, why don't we focus that into actual reductions within Alberta? And so there's a bit of delay in realizing those reductions perhaps, but it's more of what I'd call smarter investment, short-term pain, long-term gain sort of perspective.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Lisa DeMarco. Lisa is a partner with the Canadian-based international law firm of McLeod and McLeod, thank you, sorry. I knew that wasn't right. McLeod Dixon, LLP, and is a leading expert in the law relating to emissions trading. She's been working in this area for many years and has a deep breadth of experience in international emissions trading law. Lisa?
Thank you so much, Alexia, and thank you to the Center and to Global Public Relations for helping us, in particular, get to chat with you. We really appreciate the opportunity. I think we should do the same in Canada more often. The debate is very worthwhile. What I'd like to do is 4 things. The first is I want to really chat about the problem, both the problem of climate change and the problem of border tax adjustments that's motivating really much of the logjam. Secondly, I want to freely and fully disclose where my perspective arises from. So you can throw some eggs at that if you need to, but really engage from a full knowledge basis. And then thirdly, talk about how we square the circle, how we reconcile trade considerations and offset considerations going forward in 2 forms. First, talking about the substance, really the integrity piece that we were talking about, and secondly, talking about the process. And look at that in some detail, because I think that's motivating a lot of the considerations and concerns that are impediments to the adoption of offsets. So let me start out first by saying that I'm a very significant proponent of the use of offsets as a compliance mechanism domestically, internationally, and to get real reductions occurring now. And I want to emphasize the term now. We are at a considerable logjam internationally, both in achieving targets, agreeing to targets, and actually changing the trajectory of our behaviors associated with fossil fuels predominantly and reducing greenhouse gas emissions more precisely. And it's my view, based on seeing the international markets, that there's significant room for opportunity to, in a small way, reduce emissions from particular projects now. Not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, not in 2020. Actually harness what we can do with our technology now. There's a popular conception that technology and investment in technology is antithetical to offsets, and I want to dispel that myth. In particular, all of the offset projects that we've been involved in have involved novel or developing technology, have incented investment in those technologies, and have resulted in, subsequently, real emission reductions. Not the promise of emission reductions, but real emission reductions now. So that's certainly the greenhouse gas aspect of the problem. There is an imminent need for reductions. It's possible, and it needs to occur now, and it needs to occur on a wide-scale international basis so that not any one entity, not any one country is put at a competitive disadvantage. The second key aspect of the problem is what we're seeing now as almost a resurgence of Smoot-Hawley type legislation across the board. In my lifetime, I have never seen such an affinity for border tax adjustments, import tariffs, or other measures that really stand to decimate the concepts of free trade, the concepts of growth, and the concept of international cooperation that we've seen develop over the years. I need only point to the ACIS bill that's through the House that has very significant import tariff provisions and trade measures through international reserve allowance purchase requirements, and secondly, the provisions in the Senate bill that really mimic the ability for the government to impose similar import tariffs and trade restrictions. And couple that with the nature and the extent of integration, in particular of our energy markets. In electricity, we have wholly and fully integrated grids. The blackout in 2005 demonstrated that, first and foremost, that certainly one part goes out, one specific market or physical distortion can result in a North American-wide physical distortion. Secondly, in oil and gas, fully integrated pipelines, fully integrated markets, and market signals associated with the hubs for trading. The Dawn hub is clearly a North American reference point. So if we intend to proceed in a manner that imposes import tariffs, that facilitates an actual fragmentation of these fully integrated markets, we have to think very, very clearly about the impacts that that will have currently on our markets, subsequently on our consumption patterns. And To date, the conception has been that it's a one-way problem. It's an oil sands problem. If you actually look at the electricity emission performance standards differential, it's not an Alberta export problem. It's also a U.S. electricity import problem. Our electricity sector is among the cleanest in the world. Our emission performance standards associated with electricity is among the best in the world. If there's going to be a U.S. import tariff on oil exports, you can certainly expect that there will be a reciprocal import tariff on U.S. electricity associated with its increased emissions relative to Canadian electricity. So that's the problem. It's twofold. It's very real, and it's far broader than people realize. We're not just talking climate change. This is predominantly now a trade problem. So that's the problem, my perspective, so you can discount my views should you so wish to. I come at it from a very active role in the CDM, particularly in the early days. I've been involved in many of the precedent-setting projects for the World Bank International Finance Corporation, and have been very involved in policy formation for a number of governments, national, subnational, and continue to be involved in the policy debate. I also come at it from the perspective of counsel to the first offset company that was forced to reorganize as a result of an insolvency situation. So to see how badly things can go wrong associated with process. And I emphasize that was a process problem. Thirdly, I edit I'm one of the co-editors of the Climate Change Law Review that's looked very, very clearly at some of the very real problems with integrity in the CDM market and process in the CDM market. So my views are shaped from that perspective as well. And fourthly, I've always maintained a fairly active interest in trade and have written a number of the constitutional and trade-related opinions in the country that look at the real quagmire that we could end up in should we proceed down the current path of border tax adjustments and uncertain provincial federal jurisdiction over offsets. So from any of those perspectives, I'm sure you can discount my views, but I'm hoping that you'll consider them anyway. How do we square the circle? Okay. So far.
They've discounted you already.
That's right. So how do we square the circle? We've got this real problem. We have a trade problem, we have an emissions problem, and we have issues associated with trade-exposed sectors that are very afraid to act. In particular, I think the Canadian position exemplifies that. It's not on a sectoral basis, but specifically Canada for the last 4 or 5 years since ratification has been in a real challenge situation where our major trade partner does not have the same obligations and is not taking the same approach. So what do? The world is now facing the same situation associated with China and the U.S., and we're seeing it play out in the context of tires and chicken. We're also going to see it play out in the context of the Copenhagen negotiations front and center. One of the potential approaches that Dallas did refer to is looking at things more precisely on a sectoral basis, worldwide, not on a least developed country basis, not on any other artificial fragmentation of world markets, but rather looking very harshly and realistically at what the emission performance rates are associated with each of the sectors that are predominantly traded on a worldwide basis. So this would include steel, this would include energy, this would include cement, this would include any number of sectors that are well known to be world markets, and providing for emission reductions and related offsets in non-emission performance sectors on the same basis worldwide. Certainly the CDM reform and the CDM board has been very captivated with actually looking at a sectoral-based approach to attempt to address many of the regional distortions that we're seeing as associated with bias of particular members of the CDM executive board and or with a notion of compensation based on location. So that's something I think we should explore more fully when we're talking about offsets, really looking at a sectoral-based approach to achieving real emission reductions now in key sectors that certainly are working in an international market where the same technology can be achieved, where similar technology can be shared across boundaries, and where entities that implement new and advanced technologies such as carbon capture and storage can actually benefit and incent that type of technology. I'll hurry through the last submission, which is in relation to process. I had the luxury of dealing very directly with the CDM Executive Board when it decided on no notice, with no agenda, with no indication to participants that it would shut down the rules on the transfer of project participants and really cause billions of dollars worth of potential economic impact in the carbon market. And really had to explain from first principles why things like the rule of law, due process, notice, the right to actually make submissions, and a potential appeal were critical aspects of the integrity of any system. And coming from a North American tradition, it's almost like explaining feminism from first principles. It's really something we take for granted, and I don't think we can any longer. I think we have to get back into the forum, and whatever system emerges, we have to certainly emphasize the need for the critical elements of the rules of natural justice, the critical elements of due process, and ensure that that's reflected in any associated evolving system in a manner that allows the North American participant to access, get involved, engage, and subsequently transact in a system. And certainly there are a number of clear possibilities that allow us to do that. I'm cognizant of my time, Lorraine. I'm certainly hoping to have a fuller dialogue as we get into questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. Are there any clarifying questions for Lisa? Okay. Well, it's we're almost back on time schedule here, so we're doing pretty well. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bruce Usher. Bruce is the CEO of EcoSecurities, which he joined in 2002. And I'm sure all of you know EcoSecurities, so there's probably not much need for me to say more there. Bruce? Is this you?
This is me.
Which one?
I mean, your slides.
There's a risk when you're an investor in carbon offset projects and you put up a slide of a bunch of pigs. I am a financial investor. I'm also really honored to be here today because it's an unusual occasion for me. I get to serve both my countries at the same time. I'm a dual U.S. Canadian citizen, and that's kind of fun to do this two for one. Quick comment on EcoSecurities. Some of you do know us fairly well, but we have worked on over 400 emission reduction projects in about 30 or 40 countries at this point. I have 265 employees who do nothing else except work on emission reduction projects in 21 offices around the world. And about 10% of all of the UN-approved, CDM-approved projects in the world today are our projects. In other words, we have a lot of hands-on experience in the project sector. And I was asked today to first describe what's my experience in the sector, what has been my experience, what are some takeaways, and what are some recommendations. And since my time is limited, I'm going to start with a story. And the story refers to the pigs. In 2005, I sent an employee from my New York office to the Philippines to visit a project there. It was a animal waste pig farm project, like this one. We had several pig farm projects at that time. We still have a few today. And when he returned, the question I had for him is, what's the opportunity for us to expand? What's the opportunity in the Philippines? How do we expand our business there? And I said, what do pig farmers know about the market? And I understand in 2005, carbon credits were a very, very new market. This was a whole new thing. What he told me was that every pig farmer he came across in the Philippines knew all about carbon credits. They knew what they had to do to reduce emissions. They knew how to capture it. They knew how to make money from this. And this shocked me. And I said, well, how's that possible? Has the Filipino government done some education programs and capacity building? Has one of our competitors been out there and educated everyone? And where's all this knowledge coming from? He said, no. He said, they know all about the carbon markets because they play mahjong. And what he meant was they all spend every evening together, perhaps not every evening, but most evenings together, and they talk about what's going on. And the first farmer we'd done a project with, a little more money in his pocket to play mahjong with, and it gets around. And so why is this story relevant? It's not relevant because I'm telling you that Filipino pig farmers play mahjong. It's relevant because the free hand of the market is everywhere. It's everywhere. And maybe Adam Smith didn't have Filipino pig farmers in mind when he wrote The Wealth of Nations 230 years ago. But what I've experienced, since that's what I was asked to describe here, is that market mechanisms like carbon markets are far more powerful than you can imagine. Because the purpose of a carbon market is really to do three things. First, to get a polluter to internalize the problem. Second, to motivate them with an incentive. And third, to get them to take action. And that is what a market mechanism does. It does all three of those. It does it quickly, and it does it unbelievably efficiently. So what are the takeaways? Where does this go? Particularly in relation to the merits and drawbacks of international offsets. Well, the first issue I want to touch on is technology and technology development, because one of the big issues is, is technology being developed elsewhere in developing countries that should be developed in the U.S. or Canada? And where's the controller here? This is a slide of another one of our projects. This is a hydro project, Honduras, a small hydro project, Honduras. And what you'll notice about this slide is it's not high tech. This is the way projects get built in most developing countries. It's not about developing new and wonderful technologies. It's about taking generally fairly simple and well-known technologies and applying them in settings where they weren't previously applied. This is what gets done. Excuse me. The second takeaway is that when projects do use technology, they almost invariably use European, Japanese, or North American technology. This is an N2O, a fertilizer plant in China. Not a pretty place. And we, EcoSecurities, invested in the catalyst, the abatement technology, which is a slide on the left, to reduce the emissions of N2O in that project. If you look closely at the pictures, the catalyst is from Europe. I believe it's German. And the guys who the engineer on the left is not Chinese. He's I think he was German. So the technology that's going to these projects is coming from North America, Europe, or Japan. The third takeaway has to do with competitiveness of North American companies. And my takeaway is that international offsets do not diminish the competitiveness of North American companies any more than does international trade. An example here is not a slide, but I was thinking about what's an analogy here, and the analogy I feel comfortable with is something you're all familiar with, is that annoying BlackBerry in your pocket, which is a great Canadian company. Research in Motion is probably one of the great Canadian technology companies. So I took mine apart to see where it was made. I just pulled the back off. It's made in Mexico. At least mine was. And I would assume that none of yours were made in Canada. That doesn't mean that anyone should be calling for a limit on production of BlackBerries in Mexico. That doesn't take away from the success of Research in Motion. Now, one could argue that Mexico doesn't have greenhouse gas caps, and therefore we're talking about a different market. This isn't free trade. And therefore it has a competitive advantage when it comes to emissions. Well, Mexico doesn't have the same environmental regulations in any format as Canada does. It doesn't have the same labor regulations as Canada does. And yet we are still comfortable trading with Canada, and we should, because that trade benefits not just Mexicans, but benefits Canadians and Americans. The last slide I'll put up is in fact one more EcoSecurities project. It's a landfill gas capture and flare project in Mexico. And again, that equipment is not from Mexico. Even though a landfill flare project is a pretty simple set of technology, that particular set of technology comes from the UK. So my takeaway, to summarize my takeaways, is that restricting international offset credits is really the same as restricting international trade, and was a point more eloquently made by my panelist, Elizabeth. And restricting international offsets not only will harm our ability to tackle climate change and make it a far more expensive proposition for U.S. and Canadian societies, but it'll also harm the growth of clean tech in the U.S. and Canada. It won't help it. It will harm it. It will set it back. So lastly, what are my recommendations? I believe we need to move to an international crediting system that has all the benefits of the current system while also addressing what hasn't worked. Because, as was referred to, there are many things with the CDM that has not worked well. What has worked well, what we need to replicate in the CDM, is a market-based system, because markets are powerful, to encourage project developers to aggressively and creatively develop emission reduction projects. They know how to reduce emissions. No one in this room knows how to reduce emissions at a pig farm in the Philippines, but those farmers know how to do it. Second, we need a focal point mechanism to ensure contract integrity. It's the one element of the CDM that's worked beautifully well, and I would replicate that. We need robust oversight. We need severe penalties for noncompliance. And it has to have global scope, because with global scope, we get maximum volume of emission reductions at minimum economic cost. A few more points to wrap up. We should remove project-by-project assessment in favor of a positive list of projects, or the sectoral list that was referred to by Elizabeth and by Dallas at the beginning of the presentation. We should establish national benchmarks with baselines. We should include forestry, including avoided deforestation. We should streamline the project approval process. The process today takes 2 years from start to finish. Pretty interesting when there's only 3 years left in the system, but that's I'll save that for another day to discuss that. It should be less than 90 days. You cannot build a business with a project approval process of more than 90 days. And we should have a crediting period of a minimum of 10 years. If you want infrastructure development, you need a 10-year period or longer if you really want to get fundamental infrastructure change. And lastly, let me conclude by saying offsets, international offsets, are not the answer. It's an arrow in the quiver. It's a really good arrow, but it's one of many. We need technology funds. We need carbon taxes in certain scenarios. We need R&D. We need it all, because, as was pointed out by Elizabeth, time is a big issue here. And we don't have the luxury of trying credits. Oh, some of that work, let's try something else 10 years from now. Do it all today, starting with credits. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Bruce. Are there any clarifying questions for Bruce?